Hello and welcome to this Evershed Sutherland PROPcast. My name is Caroline Andresier and I am the professional support lawyer to the real estate practice group here at Evershed Sutherland. And I am joined by Kelly Holmes, who is a partner in our commercial team. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi, Caroline. Thank you for having me on the PROPcast.
You're very welcome. Would you like to take a moment or two to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yes, of course. So, hi everyone. I'm Kelly Holmes and I'm a commercial partner. I've been with Evershed Sutherland for 23 years now. I lead our property and facilities management outsourcing practice. We regularly advise clients on all aspects of the operation, management, and commercialization of their real estate, from single sites to global portfolios.
Just the person we need then to talk about property management agreements. Thank you, Kelly. For those of us who haven't spent 23 years perfecting the art of a PMA, could you give us just perhaps a few PMAs, sort of 101, the very basics, what they are, who signs up to them, what they do, kind of thing, just as a starter for 10?
Yeah, of course. So, property management agreements are at the very simplest level a contract between a property owner and a property manager. So, under the agreement, the owner appoints the manager to handle the day-to-day operations of the property on behalf of the owner. Owners or clients, they could be occupiers of the property themselves, or they could be investors, or both. Um, in terms of the types of properties that property management agreements are used for, it can be the full range of properties, from residential properties to full suite of commercial properties. So retail, leisure, industrial, office, all sorts of properties can be covered by property management agreements. It is important when you're looking at a property management agreement to identify the type of property, obviously, because there are different rules and laws that apply to whether it's residential or commercial property. And it's important to build that distinction into the property management agreement itself, particularly when it relates to things like payments from tenants and what that money can be used for further down the chain, including payment of management fees. So making that distinction is quite crucial at the start.
Okay, so that's our property management agreement to PMA, and it makes you realize how much goes into the running of a building, doesn't it? That actually you need to put a whole team of people in charge of running of your building through a PMA.
Yeah.
So looking at a kind of PMA, is there a sort of standard form? What are our typical terms to a PMA? Are they long? Are they short? Are they forever? Single property? What sort of thing are we looking at there?
Yeah, so property management agreements, they can be relatively simple documents or they can be quite comprehensive. So it really depends on the size and the scale of the property or the portfolio that they're being used for. There isn't a standard form per se, but there are lots of common features that you will find across all property management agreements. And those kind of key features or key terms that I'd expect to see in all property management agreements are things like term and termination, scope and authority, budgets and accounting. Obviously, fees and payments is a critical aspect for the manager. Records and data. Data is a really key part of a property management agreement. Liability insurance, and then obviously the regulatory compliance side of things.
Okay, so that's some pretty meaty stuff going into these contracts. These are not something written on the back of a beer mat, are they, by the sound of it?
Well,
Um,
hopefully not.
hopefully not. So how long do they last? I mean, are they year by year? Are they 10 years at a time? What's the typical term?
Yeah, again, so the typical term is very much linked again to the size and scale of the portfolio. So a typical property management agreement will tend to last between, say, 1 and 3 years. Where there's
Sure.
a larger or more complex portfolio, 3 years might be the minimum term, and you might see a 3, 5, occasionally 10, but that can be more unusual unless it's a huge global portfolio where
Hmm.
actually the process of retendering and
Yes.
replacing an incumbent property manager would just it can be quite difficult to do all of that. So you typically say 1 to 3 years and then 3 plus for those larger portfolios. Now, owners often try and include a right to extend or renew after that initial term as well, just to give themselves that flexibility. And any renewal or extension, it could be on the same terms, depending on what that initial term might be. Obviously, the longer that initial term is, obviously managers will be keen to reprice on any renewal.
Sure. Okay. So actually, 1 to 3 years, pretty typical, with perhaps an auto renewal or a sort of rolling yearly basis, something like that is the term. Okay, got you there. And what about ending them? I mean, if they've got that kind of auto renewal or they're relatively quick to turn over, are there additional turnover rights? Can they end early? Do they just expire? Tell me about termination.
Yeah, again, it follows a similar sort of path in terms of the scale of the portfolio and the rights that the owner might require. But typically, you would include clear termination rights for both the owner and the manager. So it's absolutely clear in what circumstances the agreement can come to an end, and that's critically important for the manager for that sort of continued operation of the property, because what the owner doesn't want is an abrupt ending to the
Sure.
agreement.
Mm,
And so building in rights, so you may have rights to terminate for convenience for the owner and potentially the manager, albeit if the manager does have such rights, they would tend to be for a longer notice period than what the owner might have. And then you would have default-based termination rights, so things like insolvency, of course,
sure.
material breach, poor performance, non-payment, all of those are kind of key areas. Um, for the larger portfolios, clients might need to dispose of properties. So there might be termination rights allowing the owner, when it disposes of a property, to remove that property from the scope of the agreement. And equally, owners who are perhaps in regulated industries, such as the financial services industry, may require additional termination rights to reflect sort of their regulated environment. So, for example, if there are financial concerns regarding the manager.
Right. Okay. So can you swap properties in and out if you've got a portfolio property management agreement as you buy and sell?
So that's how we would set it up, because that
Mm,
flexibility is obviously key for the owner's investment and for its strategy. And what we wouldn't want the property management agreement to do is restrict or prevent the owner from, following its
yeah.
strategic decisions. So we would normally have mechanisms within the agreement to allow properties to be added or removed, and processes around those, because it's important that, when a property is added, it's properly scoped, the services is
Sure.
properly tailored, the
Mm,
fees are
mm,
correct as well, because,
mm.
you know, we're not just looking to dump another property, and no property is necessarily a like for like. So it's
No.
important it works for the manager as well as the owner. So there will be mechanisms which kind of reflect how you add and remove properties. But typically on the removal, that would be obviously on a disposal of the owner's interest in that property.
Got you. And you mentioned scope and authority. I suppose these property managers are acting on behalf of the owner every time. So presumably their authority is quite locked down. The scope of what they do is quite defined in these agreements.
Yeah, so it is really important to clearly set out the scope of the manager's appointment and the level of the authority it has to actually act in the name of the owner, because where the manager's acting as agent, it can obviously create direct liability for the
Mm,
owner. So it's really important to
serious
have that.
stuff. Yeah.
Yes, it's really
Mm,
important to have that clarity on what the manager is authorised and not authorised to do. And there's a bit of a distinction really between the agency part and the services part, because the manager won't be acting as agent for everything. So there'll be a large chunk of the services where it's acting as a service provider, but there will be elements where it is acting in as a true agent. So, for example, handling of client monies, so the collection of rent and
right, of
service
course.
charge.
Hmm.
Obviously, those monies are always the owner's property, so that will never pass to the manager. But so it's acting as agent because it will be collecting those monies on behalf of the owner, and the owner will retain title. Things like leases, so agreeing heads of terms with prospective tenants for certain types of property, actually entering into leases, depending obviously on the value and the term and the nature of those leases on behalf of the owner, or renegotiating with existing tenants, or appointing third party service providers. So there'll be various service providers needed for the sort of maintenance of the property.
Mm,
So whether it's cleaning, security, kind of the hard FM type providers, and the kind of contracts that the manager will enter into, it will enter into in the name of the owner. And so it's
right.
really important as part of the scope and authority to include parameters around what those contracts look like. So it's not just free scope to enter into any contract on any terms, because the manager has no responsibility or liability under that contract. It's about making sure the manager leverages its expertise to secure, a good contract on market terms that reflects best practice. The fees are reasonable, the liability is reasonable, the provider has appropriate insurance, and the owner actually has the ability to get out of that contract if it needs to. So again, we would typically expect, as part of the parameters for these contracts, there to be termination rights, again on disposal or on a period of notice. So the owner retains that flexibility of who it's contracting with.
Goodness, that's a lot of responsibility, isn't it? If they're signing up, extensive property management contracts in the name of the owner, perhaps for the duration of the property management agreement, they're incurring a lot of liability for the owner there. You must have to really lock them down, really trust them to do a good job.
Yeah, and I think there's a range of services that they can enter into sort of on behalf of the owner from, simple landscaping contracts, which you
Hmm.
wouldn't expect to result in significant liabilities to, the hard FM, the actual maintenance of the
Hmm.
infrastructure of the property itself, which, if there's property damage, that can be significant risk and liability for the owner. So making sure those contracts, those big contracts where there's significant risk of property damage or potentially personal injury, those are the key areas of risk for the owner. So having a property manager who really understands that and makes sure that those contracts with those third party providers are really robust and protect the owner, as
Mm.
well as obviously delivering a good service and a consistent service. It's a really key part of that authority piece.
Okay. And that's a lot of money. Yeah, they're spending a lot of money on an owner's behalf. Presumably there's oversight of the spend, there's budgets, there's account, there's accountability for what they spend and what they incur. Presumably that's a large part of the agreement itself.
Yeah, so definitely, as an owner, obviously retaining visibility and control of expenditure is really important, as you've said. So we would always expect there to be an agreed budget for the property or for each property. So outlining the areas of proposed spend at the property for each year. So to ensure that the property is not only properly managed in accordance with the owner's obligations to tenants, but obviously that, from an owner perspective, there's a surplus of income versus expenditure. And those budgets
Yeah,
will typically
yes.
set out, they might be a line by line item of, what this expenditure relates to. And we would expect the manager to proactively manage and monitor that budget
Mm,
throughout the
sure.
year, as well as the income from the property and what is being spent, and notify the owner in advance if there looks like there could be a deficit, because hopefully on most properties there should be sufficient income and service charge to meet the expenditure and allow that sort of surplus income to be passed through to the owner. Um, all of the obligations of the manager we would expect to be in accordance with that budget. So we wouldn't expect there to be any unauthorized spend. Now, there might be, additional expenditure that needs to happen for the proper maintenance of the property. But again, we would expect the manager to come to the owner and say, actually, there's something outside the scope of the
Hmm.
budget that we
Hmm.
recommend is implemented because it's in the best interest of the property, etc., etc. And that can then be signed off by the owner. And equally, there might be an emergency expenditure pot as well that you might need to see if there's something,
Contingency.
yeah,
Sure.
something unexpected happens, because obviously securing the property and the people within the property are
Hmm.
paramount.
Hmm. Okay, sounds like a big and comprehensive job for the property manager. They get paid, presumably on what basis is the fee? Is it according to the amount of properties they look after, the size of property? Is it a percentage of the budget they spend? What about fees and payment?
Yeah, no, it's obviously definitely a key element for the manager, and making sure the manager's paid on time and promptly is obviously uh, key to success of the delivery of the services. In terms of what that fee structure looks like, I tend to see a lot of annual fixed fees these days for core
Oh,
services.
nice. Okay,
Um, there's a
certainty.
Yeah, so
Mm-hmm.
but that's often accompanied by a fee scale for additional or call-off services. So, for example, strategic advisory on a disposal, as I've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but we also do see fees linked to income. So, more so on development properties or residential properties, where it's a percentage of rental income collected. Um, Obviously, it's important to understand what the fee structure is on each property management agreement and how that's calculated. And again, typically we would expect to see a schedule which clearly sets that out, provides that clarity on how it's calculated, what it's for, and when it's paid. Um, Often management fees can be deducted from service charge monies, but that's obviously assuming that's permissible under the property
Mm-hmm.
document and there are sufficient funds, and that service charge account is obviously being managed properly and in line with the agreed budget. So all of those things go hand in hand in terms of making sure not only is the financial side of the business managed properly, but that the property manager can then make sure it's being paid on time as well.
Got you. Um, Lots of responsibility there. I'm thinking of responsibility for data. The smarter buildings get, the more data we have. I'm thinking of responsibility for insurance. regulatory and compliance, the record keeping of it all? Presumably the PMA contract will typically cover those as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think data underpins everything in property management. So it's a real key aspect of the property management agreement. So identifying obviously the property data, the tenant data, all of this is confidential information for the owner, but it's also key for the manager to actually perform the services. So it's really important that the data that's being used for the services is accurate, up to date, and maintained, because this will help reduce errors and it'll stop risks from materializing. So it's really important that that data is correct. Now, when owners appoint, say, a new property manager, they might be required to undertake a verification exercise as part of a mobilisation plan to ensure that the data is being used is correct. The format that the data is held and the system on which it's held are also important, because the owner will want access to pertinent information throughout the duration of the agreement. It'll need to have that management level information and data at its fingertips. So having that access to the data on a sort of frequent basis or even real-time access is important. But also on any termination, it's really important that that data is capable of being migrated to a new provider quickly and efficiently, and in a format that can easily be used by the new provider, because what we don't want is any interruption to the provision of the services for the buildings.
Yeah, that's got to be seamless, hasn't it, all the way through? I'm going to move us on a bit because I want to ask about the list of services to be provided. I understand that these PMAs come with a schedule list of services, and that might vary from property type to property type. And presumably that list of service is the absolute essentials, the absolute sort of meat of your property management agreement, your responsibilities between us. How comprehensive is that list? What sort of thing is included?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think the front end legal terms that we've just touched on, they won't be effective if there isn't a clear specification of the services that are being provided. So it's crucial in all property management agreements that there is a comprehensive list of services and that they cover all aspects of managing the property, and making it clear what's in scope and also what's outside of scope and therefore might attract the additional fee. So I guess thinking about the types of services I'd expect to see, I mean, there's a long list and it should be a
Sure.
comprehensive schedule, but
Hmm.
I would say they kind of fall into 5 key areas. So the first of which is advertising and leasing. So obviously things like
Nice.
marketing the property, screening tenants, agreeing heads of terms, assisting with negotiations and renewals. I'd expect lots of information about what that looks like and how it's done, and obviously complying with various laws and regulations, particularly on the marketing and the screening side of things. Secondly, tenant management. So detailed services around how rents are collected, service charges collected, how tenants are handled, how inquiries and complaints are handled. Again, I'd expect to see process maps and operating procedures, just clarifying
Nice.
what that
Hmm.
looks like in practice. Financial management is obviously a really key part of the property management services. So making sure there's monthly, quarterly, annual financial reporting to the client so they have full visibility of how the property is performing. Provision of management information, managing deposits and client bank accounts, making payments on behalf of the owner. Obviously, it's a really key element that the owner isn't in default of any of its payment obligations. And so all payments are made in a timely manner. And particularly when you think about things like insurance payments. So the owner will often have the insurance responsibility for the building. So making sure the insurance is paid on time is quite key to managing the risks under the contract.
Okay,
Um,
that is a long list.
yeah, I mean, a couple more I'll throw in there.
Yeah, yeah.
So maintenance and repairs. So we've touched on this before, but again, procuring those third-party service
Mhm.
providers, that may require the manager to tender for services, particularly if they're over a particular value. Obviously, we talked about the sort of high risk, high value FM type services. So we
Mhm.
would expect those to be tendered and for the manager to be undertaking due diligence on the providers, ensuring they're properly screened and onboarded, as well as then monitoring and managing those providers on a day-to-day basis and enforcing the owner's obligations and rights with those third-party service providers, making sure they're doing what they should be doing. And then finally, there's kind of the legal and compliance aspects. So
Mm.
making sure that the owner's statutory obligations are met. So particularly that comes in with health and safety, PAT testing, Legionella testing, making sure all of those things that should happen are happening, and obviously those risks are being mitigated.
It's making me feel quite nervous even being in a building now when you think of what all goes into it and the health and safety of it. And given that there's ever more regulation, presumably that responsibilities list is ever growing.
No, absolutely. And I think more over the last few years, we've definitely seen that list of responsibilities on property managers grow. I think obviously we've had the Building Safety Act be implemented, and that itself brings a heightened focus on health and safety, not only on owners, but also on managers who are, implementing the safety on behalf of the owners and meeting those stringent building safety standards. It's key to making sure that, there aren't any prosecutions against the owners or,
Sure.
the managers themselves. Sustainability. So we've obviously seen a lot on ESG over the last few years, and we now have the UK sustainability disclosure requirements, which require reporting on energy use and sustainability. So that, again, coming back to the data piece, data collection by the property manager, it's a key part of demonstrating compliance. So the owners will need managers to optimise energy consumption, waste management, utilise renewable resources when they're managing and operating the property and appointing those third-party providers. So that can then be reported on in a compliant fashion. As part of that sustainability piece, obviously, there's green leases, which aim to promote sustainable practice and reduce a building's environmental impact. So again, the ability for the manager to liaise with the tenants about energy use and share that data with the owner. Again, it's a real key part of the data collection and sustainability reporting piece. And probably should mention data protection. Whilst data protection has been around for a long time, there's obviously continued developments in the data protection area. And I think what we've seen over the years is probably a changed approach to how data protection is dealt with under property management agreements. Property managers are managing increasing amounts of personal data in relation to tenants. So, for example, from screening, and it's really important to make sure it's done in a compliant manner in accordance with applicable laws and regulations. And in order to do that in the property management agreement, you have to identify the role and capacity in which each of the owner and the manager are actually acting, whether that's controller, joint controller, independent controller, or controller and processor. And the capacity in which they're acting is actually dictated by the facts of the situation and can actually differ between agreements. So it's not a one size fits all.
Oh, goodness,
And,
right.
and given the scope of the services that might be covered by a property management agreement, it could actually differ in the same agreement itself. So, for example, if a manager is marketing to prospective tenants, it could be acting as a controller in its own right because it has those tenants' details already in its database, as opposed to it collecting rents from existing tenants or doing further work with existing tenants, where it might be acting as a processor. So it's really important to understand exactly who's in control of the data and who's making the decisions, because that will inform what those provisions need to look like.
Data protection, a complete minefield. Actually, we had a previous PROPcast on it, and it makes you realise how complicated it is. So, given those great long list of regulatory responsibilities, and given that the owner is appointing the manager and paying the manager to do this, is it actually possible, though, for an owner to divest all of its responsibilities that come inherent with the ownership of the asset by way of the PMA? Can you offload everything as a property owner you are responsible for onto your property manager?
No, quite simply. I know.
Oh, goodness,
So
no.
you can obviously delegate many responsibilities to a manager, and that the service specification can be really comprehensive. So most things can be undertaken by the manager, but it doesn't completely absolve the owner of all of the responsibilities. So the owner still has liability at a statutory level in certain circumstances, and obviously it still has ultimate liability for the property itself. And even where the manager's undertaking the majority of the responsibilities, it won't necessarily take on all of the liabilities associated with them. And obviously that's a key part of the risk profile of any property management agreement, to make sure that the risk is, proportioned between the owner and the manager according to their roles and responsibilities, the property insurance and things like that. So having the liability position clearly set out and the roles and responsibilities clearly set out is probably the best way of mitigating risks. And good property managers, they keep owners informed of potential risks and issues
Sure.
to allow owners to make informed decisions in a timely manner and protect their investments. It's a it's a relationship or a partnership where they're
Hmm.
both working for the same thing.
Okay. Um, just in our last 3 or 4 minutes, um, that's a lot of information all about PMAs as is. What about the sort of trends you're seeing then? What is the future for property management agreements? Have you got other issues coming over the horizon that'll add to that list of services or be yet another thing to draft for? What are you seeing as the future of PMAs?
Yeah, so I think certainly in terms of more provisions in PMAs, I think going back to sort of the Building Safety Act and that, health and safety and regulatory compliance, both owners and managers will need to keep abreast of changes in the legal and regulatory landscape. And obviously, there's been increasing public scrutiny in this area with Grenfell and the outcome of the
Sure.
report on that. So it's really an area that needs to be prioritised. So anything safety related, I think we'll see more comprehensive obligations and discussions around what that looks like between owners and managers. Obviously, on sustainability and ESG, we already have sort of comprehensive obligations that I'd expect to see on things that cover the S&G. So, anti-bribery, anti-slavery, anti-tax evasion in property management agreements. But that sustainability piece, I think we'll see more clauses coming into PMAs around that. So things mandating energy efficient practices, water reduction, use of renewable resources. There'll be more clauses that start to come in around
Hmm.
dealing with those. And then on the technology side, so there's increased use of prop tech in property management arrangements and digital tools. So alongside of those sort of property technology kind of provisions, we're going to need more data protection, as we've talked about, as well as
Sure.
cybersecurity measures to make sure that tenant data, property data is properly safeguarded in the property management agreement. So the prop tech piece is quite a key part of that. And whether that's using the property manager system, or actually we're seeing a lot of owners procuring their own property management systems where they've got huge
Right.
portfolios. So making sure that those systems are properly interfaced and that cybersecurity is properly reflected and dealt with, we're definitely going to see more provisions around that. I think in terms of the immediate horizon, obviously in January, we'll see the implementation of the RICS new global standard, so property agency and management principles, and that brings together different agency and management principles.
So that's
Um,
the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. That's their new global standard.
it
Yeah.
is, yes, and it
Right.
will be it'll be mandatory for all of their members
Oh,
and
right.
regulated
Okay.
firms.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and it's aimed at ensuring a consistent professional standard, focusing on openness, transparency, and accountability. Now, in terms of the property management agreement, I don't think the new standard introduces any obligations I would already expect to see in a property management agreement,
Right.
but it does sort of emphasize the importance of, the openness, the transparency, and the accountability, and it reinforces the position on specific requirements. So how fees are calculated, there needs to be transparency there. How client monies are dealt with, obligations on the manager to ensure they're meeting their contractual obligations, they're meeting key timescales, they're complying with the owner's instructions. So all of these I would expect to see in the property management agreement anyway, but it's nice for them to be reinforced so there's that
Sure.
consistent approach across the industry.
That's quite similar to the service charge provision where we have the RICS professional statement on service charge, so very similar.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's January. Anything further out on the horizon in our last
Well,
moment?
yeah, I think probably the last point to probably mention is how AI can be used in
Right.
property management.
Hmm.
So AI has been used for quite a long time already in building management systems, but I think the advent of generative AI is where there's going to be a real sort of step change in property management over the next 5 to 10 years, and digital tools, how managers interact with tenants, so communications, chatbots, that kind of thing. It'll be really interesting to see how Gen AI impacts the property management industry.
Okay, that's all very interesting. So thank you very much, Kelly. I've learned a lot about property management agreements this morning. And to everyone who has joined us, thank you for listening.